40th day without the Astronomican, Rector Voss received a devotional census report from a district that had been on fire for 2 weeks, formatted correctly, sealed properly, signed by an administrator whose body he had identified himself. The cathedral woke before he did. This was not unusual. The Cathedral of the Undying Flame had been waking before its occupants for 417 years, and it had developed in that time the specific institutional momentum of a thing that did not require human intention to continue. The morning bell servitors activated at the 4th hour. Their mechanisms wound the previous evening by the same junior sexton who had wounded them for 19 years, and whose hands moved through the task in complete darkness without error. The heating ducts in the primary nave began their cycle at the 4th hour and 12 minutes, as they had since the reign of the 3rd Rector, because the stone of the nave took precisely 48 minutes to warm to a temperature at which the congregation's breath would not be visible during the dawn, devotional, and a visible congregation was, in Rector Voss's view, a distracted one. The lumen strips in the administrative corridor activated at the 4th hour and 30 minutes, and by the time Voss himself arrived at his desk at the 5th hour, carrying his recaf in the same chipped mug he had carried for 11 years, and would not replace because replacing it would require deciding what to replace it with, the Cathedral of the Undying Flame was already fully, correctly, procedurally awake. He sat down. He arranged the morning's documents in the order he would address them. He did this every morning, not because the documents required a specific order, but because the act of ordering them was itself a form of preparation, a small ceremony of readiness that cost nothing, and produced in him the particular settled quality of a mind that knew where it was and what it was for. Outside the single narrow window above his desk, Verath's landing was the color of an old bruise. This had been true for 31 days, since the ash from the lower hive collapses had reached the upper atmosphere and begun its slow work of filtering what remained of the morning light into something wrong. Voss did not look at the sky if he could help it. The sky had become, in the past 40 days, a problem he could not file. The Astronomican's absence was a problem he could not file. The silence from the upper spire, 30 days now, since the last Vox transmission, since the last sealed communique with the planetary governor's cipher on its outer casing, was a problem he could not file. He had noted all 3 in his personal log, under the heading Outstanding Matters Requiring Escalation, and he had placed the log in his desk's lower drawer, and he had not opened the drawer since, because the items in it were not getting smaller, and looking at them again would not make them smaller, and there was work on his desk that could actually be done. He was, in this respect, a man of almost heroic practical limitation. He understood this about himself. He had made his peace with it 20 years ago, in his first posting as a junior census clerk in the Ministerum's Segmentum Obscurus administrative division, when his supervising prefect had told him that the difference between a clerk who lasted and a clerk who broke was simple. The ones who last never try to carry what they can't put down. Voss had been carrying that advice for 40 years and had never once tested its limits because he had never allowed a situation to reach the point where it might be tested. He picked up the first document on the stack. He read the header. He read the origin stamp. He read the administrator's cipher seal, which he recognized because he had processed Administrator Herath Coln's documentation for 7 years and knew the particular slight irregularity in the lower loop of the cipher's 3rd glyph, the way a small imperfection in the seal stamp produced the same minor deviation every time, reliably, the way all authentic seals produce their maker's specific flaws with more consistency than their intended perfection. The seal was correct. The deviation was there. The lower loop. The 3rd glyph. Herath Coln had been dead for 14 days. Voss had identified the body himself in the triage area set up in the cathedral's outer vestibule when the survivors of the sublevel Quintus collapse had been brought up. He had performed the identification because it was his administrative responsibility to do so, and because someone had to and no one else had been available. He had recorded it in triplicate as required. He had filed it correctly. He read the census report. It was formatted correctly. Every column populated, every figure cross-referenced against the preceding period's count, every change annotated with its source document. Births, deaths, transfers, confirmed casualties. The casualty list from sublevel Quintus's collapse was there, accurate to the figure, with each name cross-referenced to an individual record. Herath Koln's own name appeared on it, with the correct date of death, and Voss's own cipher as the confirming authority. The report accounted for its own author's death, in Herath Koln's handwriting, sealed with Herath Koln's seal. Voss sat with it for 47 seconds. He was aware of the time because he was always aware of the time, and 47 seconds was precisely how long it took him to exhaust every administrative explanation available to him. Pre-written report submitted by a deputy, cached system generating from a template, forgery produced by someone with access to Collins' seal and sufficient knowledge of census format to reproduce it without error. He moved through these explanations in order, examined each one against the specific weight of the document in his hands, and set each one aside. Pre-written reports did not include their author's own death with the correct confirming authority. Cached systems did not update casualty lists in real time. Forgeries did not reproduce the lower loop. He picked up his log. He wrote, Day 40. Census report received from sublevel Quintus administrative. Origin stamp authentic. Content consistent with current data. Source unclear. Retaining for further investigation. He placed the report in the stack marked pending. He placed the log in the lower drawer with the other outstanding matters. He picked up the second document on the stack. He would get back to it. The Cathedral of the Undying Flame could hold 12,000 souls in its primary nave, which meant that the 3,000 currently sheltering within it occupied the space with the specific quality of a congregation that was both much larger than a cathedral expected and much smaller than a cathedral was designed for. They filled the nave's first third. They spread into the side chapels, the ambulatory, the devotional alcoves along the north wall where the votive racks had been stripped of their candles and replaced with bedrolls, and the small salvage possessions of people who had left their homes very quickly and taken only what was already in their hands. Voss conducted the dawn devotional from the pulpit at the nave's head, looking out over a congregation that had doubled in the past 40 days and changed in character in ways he was still cataloguing. The cathedral's permanent faithful, the staff, the long-term parish, the retired administratum workers who lived in the Upper Hives Cathedral district and had been attending morning devotionals since before Voss arrived, occupied their usual positions in the front rows with the ease of long practice. Behind them, in widening rings of unfamiliarity, were the others. Workers from the collapsed sublevels, soldiers from 3 different regiments, most of them without officers, most of them present because the cathedral was warm and offered food twice daily, and because human beings, when stripped of their structure, have a tendency to orient themselves toward the nearest available structure, regardless of whether they had any previous relationship with it. Voss did not find this troubling. He found it, in fact, precisely correct. The Ministerum's purpose was to maintain the Emperor's light in exactly these circumstances, not in the comfortable parishes of prosperous worlds, but in the places where comfort had been removed and people were standing in the dark trying to remember how to function. He had prepared his remarks accordingly. A short passage from the Lectitio Divinitatus on endurance, a prayer for the dead from the collapsed districts, a closing invocation for the Astronomican's return that he had worded with careful administrative neutrality, so as not to imply certainty about something he could not confirm. He was midway through the endurance passage when he noticed Sister Caslin. She was standing at the nave's eastern edge, in the shadow of the third pillar, with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes moving through the congregation in a specific, systematic way that he recognized as clinical rather than devotional. She was not attending the service. She was surveying it with the particular quality of attention that medical personnel deployed when they were looking for something they hoped not to find. Her hospitaler's white was crisp despite 40 days of reduced supply lines, which told him something about her that he filed. This was a woman who maintained standards as a form of discipline rather than as an expression of comfort. At the back of the nave, Trooper Saw was doing something with his arms that involved crossing them and leaning against the rear pillar with the flat, uninvested expression of a man who had been told he was required to be present and had interpreted this requirement as narrowly as possible. He was not participating. He was not disrupting. He was occupying the minimum amount of devotional space a human body could occupy while technically fulfilling the requirement to attend. Voss had seen this before, in soldiers and junior administratum workers and newly arrived refugees who had not yet found their way to the faith or decided whether they intended to look for it. He did not take it personally. The cathedral was patient. It had been patient for 417 years, and it would be patient for Trooper Saul. Lector Archivist Dre was not present. She was never present for morning devotionals. Voss had, some years ago, stopped expecting her and begun recording her absence as a baseline rather than a deviation. Senna Dre attended devotionals on the Emperor's feast days and on the anniversaries of the cathedral's founding, which he suspected she observed less from piety than from the archivist's instinct that feast days generated documentation worth witnessing. She was, in her way, faithful. Her faith expressed itself as the preservation of record, which was a form of devotion he respected even when it produced absences from dawn devotionals. He finished the endurance passage. He led the prayer for the dead. The responses from the congregation were the loudest and most certain he had heard in years. The specific quality of voices that had recently been reminded, concretely and at close range, why the prayer was necessary. He noted this. He was, despite everything, moved by it. The closing invocation for the Astronomican's return he delivered, with the careful neutrality he had prepared, and the congregation received it with a silence that was attentive rather than disappointed, which he chose to read as faith rather than resignation. He stepped down from the pulpit. The cathedral continued its mourning around him, correctly, as it always had. The second and third reports arrived before the mid-hour bell. The second was from sublevel Septimus Administrative, a district that had been sealed by structural collapse for 22 days, its access corridors blocked by 40 meters of fallen hive plate, its population listed in the casualty projections as either dead or unaccounted for in approximately equal measure. The census figures were current. The casualty updates were accurate to the last notification Voss had received from the surface recovery teams. The cipher seal belonged to Administrator Preth, who was unaccounted for. The third was from Cathedral District 12, the residential sector immediately adjacent to the cathedral's south wall, which had been evacuated after the ashfall began, and which Voss's own records showed as currently uninhabited. The population count was 312. He checked his records. 312 was the exact figure from the district's last census, filed 4 weeks ago, before the evacuation. It had not been updated to reflect the evacuation. It was as though, for the purposes of this report, the evacuation had not occurred. He laid all 3 reports on his desk and looked at them. The administrative mind is a peculiar instrument. It is trained to find pattern, to locate the explanation that accounts for the available data, to resist the pull toward the anomalous, because anomalies are, in the vast majority of cases, clerical errors rather than genuine deviations from the known order of things. Voss had spent 40 years training that instrument, and he applied it now with the disciplined thoroughness of a man who had earned his professional certainty slowly and was not prepared to surrender it without cause. The explanation he arrived at first, a subsystem, some cached administrative process running on the Cathedral's internal cogitator network, was generating these reports automatically from stored census data. The reports looked current because they were drawing on the most recent available data for each district, which happened to be accurate, and the cogitator was not sophisticated enough to flag that some of its data sources were no longer active. He examined this explanation against the evidence of the cipher seals. A cogitator system generating automatic reports would use a system-generated authentication stamp, not individual administrator cipher seals, with their specific, unreproducible physical imperfections. The lower loop on Coln's seal, the hairline fracture in the 7th glyph of Preth's seal that Voss had been meaning to flag for recutting for 2 years. A cogitator could not reproduce these. A cogitator did not know they existed. The explanation he arrived at second, someone with access to the Cathedral's administrative archive, which contained impression records of all active cipher seals for the purpose of authentication verification, had used those records to produce forgeries. He tested this against what he knew about the forgery process. Producing a convincing impression from an archive record was possible, but required specific technical equipment, time, and a reason to produce documents that contained no false data and made no claims that would benefit their producer. He could not construct a motivation. Forgeries existed to assert things that were not true. These reports asserted nothing that was not true. They were simply current, accurate, and impossible. He noted the anomaly. He wrote, Day 40, mid-morning. Additional census reports received from sublevel Septimus and Cathedral District 12. Administrative explanation sought. Administrative explanation not found. Origin stamp for all 3 reports. Cathedral sublevel, Tertius administrative, retaining for investigation. He paused. He read what he had written. Then he wrote beneath it, Sublevel Tertius has been structurally condemned for 11 years. There is no administrative presence in sublevel Tertius. There has been no administrative presence in sublevel Tertius since the condemnation order was filed in the 42nd year of the current Rector's tenure, which is to say my own tenure, which is to say I filed the condemnation order myself, and I know for a certainty that it was correctly executed. He closed the log. He placed it in the lower drawer. He went to find the Lector archivist. The archive occupied the cathedral's northeastern tower from the ground floor to the 7th level, which meant it occupied more vertical space than any other single function in the building, and considerably more horizontal space than was immediately apparent from the tower's exterior dimensions, because Senadre had, over 20 years of occupancy, developed a relationship with the available square footage that an outside observer might have described as aggressive. Every wall was shelved. Every shelf was full. The navigation of the archive required not only Dre's permission, but practically speaking, Dre's guidance, because the organization of the collection followed a logic that was entirely internally consistent and entirely opaque to anyone who had not spent years learning it. Voss had spent some years learning it. He had learned enough to know that the logic existed and that he did not understand it. He found her at the central reading table on the 3rd level, surrounded by documents in a specific arrangement that she would be able to reconstruct from memory if anyone disturbed it, which was why no one disturbed it. She was wearing her reading lenses, which made her eyes look large and slightly owl-like, and she was holding a document at the specific angle she held documents, when she was running a physical authentication. The slight backward tilt that put the seal impression in the correct relationship to the overhead lumen for maximum contrast. She looked up at him over the lenses. "You got them too," she said. It was not a question. He sat in the chair across from her. "How many?" "As of this morning, 17. She set the document down with the care of someone setting down something that was behaving unexpectedly and might continue to do so. "The first came 9 days ago. I filed it under origin unclear and assumed someone in the upper administrative staff had the explanation. When no explanation came, I filed the second one the same way. By the 5th, I had begun to run tests. By the 9th, I had run every test I know how to run." She removed her reading lenses and set them on the table. "Amalric, this document." She touched the edge of the one she had been holding when he arrived, with the careful minimal contact of a doctor touching something she had not yet diagnosed. "Is a level 3 liturgical confirmation record from sublevel Tertius, dated yesterday. The format is correct for a current year ministorum confirmation in this diocese. The ink chemistry is consistent with the Cathedral's standard issue stock. The seal is the seal of Lector Pravan, who held the sublevel's liturgical office before the condemnation. Pravan transferred to Hive Secundus 18 years ago," Voss said. "Yes, I verified that." She looked at him steadily. His seal did not go with him. His seal was logged into the archive's impression record when he transferred out, and has been in the archive's sealed storage since. "I checked the storage this morning. The seal is still there. It has not been removed. And yet..." She touched the document again, the same careful contact. "The impression on this document matches the archived seal perfectly. Not approximately, not to within acceptable authentication variants. Perfectly. As though the seal were used directly." Voss looked at the document. He looked at Senna. He thought about the lower loop on Herath Koln's seal and decided not to mention it yet, because the information would not help either of them, and there was a specific kind of conversation he was not prepared to have until he had exhausted every available alternative. "Sublevel Tertius," he said. "Sublevel Tertius," she confirmed. "The condemnation order. Fully executed. Structurally sound in the sense that there is no active risk of collapse. The condemnation was precautionary, following the moisture survey. The physical structure is intact. The access stairs are sealed with a standard ministorum security lock, the cipher for which is held by your office and mine." She paused. "And has not been used. I checked the lock's usage log this morning. It has not been opened since the condemnation." They sat with this for a moment. 17 documents, Voss said. 17. All in correct format. All authenticated. All originating from an administrative function that has not existed for 11 years, in a space that has not been entered in 11 years, sealed with seals that have not left their storage. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she had finished presenting evidence and was waiting for the responsible authority to draw the conclusion she had already drawn and was being professionally patient about. "I have been filing them. I assumed the correct response was to preserve the record and wait for clarification. I am now asking for clarification because I have run out of things to do while waiting." He had no clarification to offer. He told her he would investigate. He meant it. He left the archive with the specific gait of a man who has just had a framework quietly removed from beneath him and is walking carefully because he has not yet identified what he is standing on. He took the long route back to his office. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. There were 2 routes from the archive tower to the administrative wing, and he chose the one that took him through the lower nave corridor rather than the upper gallery, because the lower nave corridor was warmer, and because warmth had become, in 40 days of failing infrastructure, a consideration that overrode minor matters of route preference. The lower nave corridor ran parallel to the cathedral's north foundation wall. On its south side, it opened at intervals into the nave's side chapels. On its north side, there was stone and, at the corridor's midpoint, a single door. The door to the access stairs for sublevel Tertius. He had passed it hundreds of times without considering it. He passed it now and slowed, without deciding to slow, because the air was different in this section of the corridor, and different was, in his experience, a category that rewarded attention. The door was sealed. The lock's indicator light showed green, which meant the cipher had not been entered, and the lock had not been cycled. He checked it with the habit of an administrator, not because he expected to find it wrong, but because checking was the correct procedure. The seal was intact. The lock was correct. The air near it was warm. Not the warmth of the heating ducts, which had a specific directional quality, moving air with a source and a destination. This was resident warmth, the warmth of a space that had been occupied for long enough to retain heat in its stone. It had the quality of a room that has not been empty. It should have the quality of a room that has been empty for 11 years, which was a different quality entirely. The specific settled coldness of unoccupied space, the temperature of abandonment, and beneath the warmth, something else. He stood still and identified it with the methodical care he applied to all identification tasks. Not the cathedral's approved incense, which he knew well enough to distinguish in any concentration. The sharp-edged compound of resins and sacred oils that the Ministerum's liturgical supply chain had been providing to this cathedral for 4 centuries, consistent in character, if occasionally variable in quality. This was something older, something that reminded him, without producing the specific memory that would let him name the association, of the crypt-level chapels in the cathedral's foundation. The smell of stone and time, and underneath both, something that was warm and present, and should not have been either. He noted it. He described it in his log with the precision he brought to all documentation. Air temperature near sublevel Tertius access point, elevated above corridor ambient. Olfactory anomaly noted. Character, warm, organic, consistent with long-term occupation. Not consistent with 11 years of sealed vacancy. Not consistent with known incense stocks. He went to evening devotionals. The evening devotional was shorter than the morning service, and quieter. The congregation thinned by the practical demands of a cathedral, housing 3,000 people. The cooking shifts, the medical rotations, the perimeter watch that Trooper Saw had organized with 3 other soldiers, with the efficiency of men who had no commanding officer, but considerable professional pride. The faithful who came to evening devotionals came because they chose to, which gave the service a specific character, more concentrated, more genuinely present, the way any gathering is different when attendance is voluntary rather than structural. Voss found the evening devotionals the most sustaining part of his day. He had always found them so, and he found them so now, despite everything. Despite 40 days of silence and ash light, and a drawer full of outstanding matters, and 17 documents from a space that had not been entered in 11 years. The words of the closing litany were the same words they had been for 400 years, and the congregation's responses came back to him in the nave's stone acoustics, with the warmth of a thing that had been said so many times in this space that the saying of it had become part of the space itself. He walked back to his office afterward through the upper gallery rather than the lower corridor, because he was, with the administrative honesty he applied to all self-assessment, not ready to pass the door again tonight. He sat at his desk. He arranged the documents from the day into their closing order. He prepared the next morning's intake stack. He found the report at the bottom of the intake stack. It was filed under Cathedral Administrative Primary. Daily Summary. It was dated today. It was in the standard summary format he used himself, the same column structure, the same annotation protocol. the same subheading hierarchy he had developed over 11 years in this office, and which was, he was aware, particular enough to be individual, not a format anyone else in the Cathedral used, because no one else in the Cathedral had reasons to use it. The cipher seal was his. He examined the lower loop of the second glyph, the slight compression on the left side where the seal stamp had acquired a minor deformation 6 years ago when he had dropped it. He knew that deformation. He had been meaning to have it corrected for 6 years. He read the report. Every figure was current. Every population change from the day's movement through the Cathedral, the new arrivals from the Eastern Approach Road, the 3 deaths in the Medici wing, the census adjustment for the 17 soldiers who had been formally assigned to the Cathedral's billet roster by whatever remained of their chain of command, was accurately recorded. The documentation cross-references were correct. The formatting was his. He had not written this report. He had not left his office today except to attend devotionals and to visit the archive and to walk the lower corridor past a sealed door in warm air. He had not written this report. He sat with it for a long time, reading his own handwriting in a document he had never written, and he found that the thing that frightened him most was not the forgery. It was that every census figure in it was correct. Chapter 2. What the Body Confirms. Sister Caslin had recorded 14 impossible recoveries in 9 days, and the thing that kept her awake was not the impossibility. It was that she had started to feel grateful for them. She had learned to read bodies the way Senadre read documents. This was not a metaphor she had arrived at herself. It had been given to her by the surgeon who trained her, a hospitaller of 30 years' service named Sister Aldrich, who had the specific economy of movement that came from decades of working in spaces too small and too loud and too full of dying people to permit wasted motion. The body tells you what it needs, Aldrich had said, on the first day of Neve's surgical apprenticeship, and it tells you what it has. Your job is to read it, not interpret it, not impose a framework on it. Read it. The body does not lie. It has no reason to. Neve had carried that instruction for 11 years, and she carried it now through the Medici wing of the Cathedral of the Undying Flame at the 5th hour of the morning, when the lumen strips were at their lowest setting, and the ward had the specific quality of stillness that existed only in the window between the last night watch check and the first morning round. The quality of a space that had been breathing quietly for several hours and was not yet aware of being observed. She stopped at the first bed. Ro Castem, 47, factory worker from sublevel Quintus, admitted 11 days ago with crush injuries from the collapse, 3 fractured ribs, bilateral contusions across the thoracic region, a splenic laceration that she had assessed on admission as survivable with intervention and had intervened accordingly. The intervention had gone correctly. The prognosis had been 4 weeks minimum recovery, with a non-trivial risk of secondary complications from the splenic repair. She read his chart. She checked his dressings. She pressed carefully along the line of the fractured ribs. He did not wince. His breathing, which had been the shallow, guarded breathing of someone managing pain with every inhalation, was full and even. She replaced the dressing she had lifted and stood with his chart in her hands and looked at the numbers in a column that should have shown a 4-week recovery gradient and instead showed something she did not have a clinical term for, not an acceleration, an erasure, as though the injury were being unmade rather than repaired, working backward from consequence to absence rather than forward from damage to healing. She wrote, Day 11, Castem, Ashkar, splenic repair site, showing complete tissue integration, rib fractures demonstrating consolidation significantly in advance of projected timeline, no clinical explanation for rate of recovery, all vitals within optimal parameters, recommend continued monitoring. She moved to the next bed, and the next, and the next. By the time she reached the 14th bed, Jenna Prast, 61, retired lumen strip fitter, admitted with a traumatic head wound from the quintus collapse that Neve had, on admission, quietly assessed as unsurvivable, and had treated accordingly while communicating a more measured prognosis to the patient's family, because the measured prognosis was also honest and the unsurvivable assessment served no one. She had written 14 versions of the same notation, with 14 different patient names and 14 different injuries and one consistent finding. They were all recovering. They were all recovering at a rate that her 11 years of surgical practice could not account for. And they were all, when she looked at their faces in the low lumen light, sleeping with an expression she associated not with the restless, effortful sleep of people fighting their bodies back toward function, but with something deeper. The sleep of people who had, for the first time in some time, put something down. She sat at her desk at the ward's head and looked at the column of 14 notations and did what she always did when the clinical data produced a result she could not explain. She placed the data in the framework her training provided for exactly this category of result. The Emperor's grace expressed through healing was documented. It was not common. In 11 years she had seen it twice, and both times had been in circumstances of such extremity that the survival itself had been the miracle, and the healing merely its confirmation. She knew its signature, the specific quality of recovery that exceeded the biological mechanism that did not simply accelerate healing, but altered its character, produced tissue that was not scar, but original, restored function that injury had not merely impaired, but destroyed. This had that signature. This had that signature and something underneath it that she could not name and could not place in the documented framework, and could not, with the honesty Sister Aldrich had trained into her, simply set aside in favor of the explanation that was available and comfortable, and required no further investigation. She wrote in her personal log, beneath the clinical notations, "The recoveries are real. The recovery rate is impossible by biological measure. The quality of healing is consistent with documented instances of the Emperor's grace in extremis. I am a sister hospitaller. I am trained to recognize this. I am trained to receive it with gratitude and to record it accurately and to continue my work." She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She added, "I am not comfortable. I do not know why I am not comfortable. I am going to find out." She heard it first at the 7th hour, when the ward had come to its morning level of activity. The breakfast distribution, the medication rounds, the low murmur of patients talking and not talking, and doing the specific work of people who are trying to locate their own limits on a given day. She was at the supply cabinet in the ward's far corner, conducting the morning inventory, a task so routine that her hands performed it without requiring her full attention, which meant her full attention was available for the thing that arrived at the edge of her hearing and stayed there. She stopped counting bandage rolls. It was coming from below. Through the stone floor, through however many meters of cathedral foundation, separated the medici wing from the sublevels, through the specific density of 4-century-old construction that should have rendered anything below inaudible. It was coming through all of that, and it was clear. A liturgical antiphonal, call and response in the correct ministorum format, the 3-beat call phrase, the congregation's response at the cadence, the cantor's confirmation, the repetition. She knew this antiphonal. She had sung it during her novitiate at the Schola Hospitalis on Forge World Lathana, in the chapel at the end of every night's study for 3 years. It was the antiphonal of the Undying Watch, a minor liturgy used in continuous devotional services, designed for use when a congregation needed to maintain worship through a night or a long vigil. Not a common piece, not the passages everyone knew, the kind of liturgy that required specific training and regular practice to perform correctly. She went to the floor. She did not make a decision to do this. Her knees found the stone before she had consciously directed them, the way they found the stone at prayer without requiring instruction. She pressed her palm flat against the floor and felt the vibration of it, not the structural vibration of the building's systems, which she knew from 11 years in various cathedral hospitals and had catalogued as ambient, but something with rhythm. The antiphonal had rhythm, and the rhythm was in the stone, and the stone was carrying it up through the building and into her palm with the specific quality of a sound that was not diminished by the distance it had traveled. She listened. The voices were wrong in a way she could not immediately locate. Not wrong in pitch. The intervals were correct. Not wrong in cadence. The timing was precise. She listened for several minutes, tracking the call and the response and the confirmation before she found it. The responses came before the calls were finished. Not slightly before, not the anticipatory overlap of a congregation that knew the liturgy well enough to begin the response at the last beat of the call. Before, a full beat before, as though the voices below did not need to hear the call in order to know what response was required, as though the call and response were not communicating, as though they were simply occurring in their correct order, because that was the order they were in. She lifted her palm from the stone. She stood. She thought about the access stairs at the nave's northern corridor and the sealed door with its unbroken lock and the warm air that Rector Voss had mentioned to her yesterday in the passing, careful way he mentioned things he had not yet decided how to think about. She went back to her patients, because her patients were here and she could help them, and the access stairs were a different problem, and she was a hospitaller, and hospitalers triaged. She did not go back to the floor. She told herself this was because the inventory required finishing. She finished it. She did not go back to the floor. 3 levels up and 400 meters east, in the archive tower's 3rd level, Lector archivist Senna Dre was doing something she had never done in 20 years of archival practice. She was maintaining 2 sets of records for the same collection. The parallel archive had begun not as a decision, but as a deferral. The first document from sublevel Tertius had been so thoroughly anomalous that she had placed it in a separate folder simply because no existing category fit it, with the intention of creating the correct category once she understood what she was dealing with. 9 days and 31 documents later, the separate folder had become a separate archive, occupying a locked drawer she had cleared for the purpose, and the category remained uncreated because she remained with the intellectual honesty that 20 years of document work had made non-negotiable, uncertain what category would be accurate. She ran the new test this morning with the systematic thoroughness she brought to all authentication work. She had in the cathedral's historical records 3 confirmed forgeries, all from the same period, a minor administrative fraud from M41.340, when a junior lector had been producing false devotional compliance records to cover his district's declining attendance. She had used these forgeries for years as teaching examples because they were instructive. They showed, in microscopic detail, all the ways that forgeries betrayed themselves to a trained reader. Seal pressure was the most reliable tell. A seal used directly produced a specific depth and evenness of impression that could not be replicated from an archived record, however good the reproduction technology. The forged records from M41.340 showed 3 to 5% variation in seal depth across the impression surface, well within the range that a casual reader would miss and that an experienced archivist would flag. She placed the sublevel Tertius documents under the examination lens. She measured the seal impressions. She recorded the figures. 0 variation. Across 31 documents. 0. She ran the ink chemistry next. Standard Ministorum stock had a specific chemical signature, iron gall based, with a particular ratio of tannic acid to iron sulfate that had remained consistent across the segmentum obscurus supply chain for 2 centuries. Forgeries that used salvaged or substitute ink showed deviations in this ratio that were small enough to miss visually and large enough to measure. She had a portable spectrometer in the archive's 3rd level for exactly this purpose. The ink was correct, not approximately correct, precisely correct, to a degree that the cathedral's current stock, which had been in storage for 8 months and had undergone the minor degradation that all stored ink underwent, did not match. The sublevel tertius ink was more precisely correct than the ink the cathedral was currently using. She sat back. She wrote in her personal log, "A document cannot be more authentic than authentic. The category does not exist. And yet I am looking at 31 documents that are, by every measure I possess, more authentic than the authenticated originals they purport to originate from. This does not mean what I initially thought it meant. It means something else. I do not yet know what it means. I am going to find out, because that is what I do, and because the alternative is to file these in the outstanding drawer, and I have had enough of the outstanding drawer." She locked the parallel archive. She went back to the primary collection. She began pulling the cathedral's historical records for the preceding century, because 20 years of archival instinct had given her the specific wordless certainty that the current situation had a precedent, and the precedent was in this building, and she was going to find it. She would find more than she was looking for. She did not know this yet. The factory worker's name was Cale Broven. Neve had his intake record memorized. 43 years old, no listed religious affiliation, primary occupation maintenance engineering in the sub-level Quintus fabrication district. Admitted with the second wave of collapse survivors, his injuries significant. But, unlike several of his fellow survivors, survivable. He had been in the first days of his admission, a straightforward patient, cooperative, uncomplaining, the specific stoic quality of a manual worker who had spent a life treating his body as a tool and extended this attitude to his recovery. She had not expected the prayer. She was completing the mid-morning medication round when she heard him. Not loudly, not the performative volume of public devotion, but the low, steady recitation of someone doing something privately, for their own reasons, that happened to be occurring in a shared space. She paused at the foot of his bed. He was sitting upright. Upright, when 3 days ago, the effort of sitting upright had required 2 orderlies and produced a visible cost in his face that she had noted in his chart. With his hands open on his knees and his eyes not quite closed, focused on something at a middle distance that was not the ward ceiling. She listened to what he was saying. She knew the Lectitio Divinitatus in the way that all hospitallers knew it, completely, from years of mandatory study and daily liturgical practice, its structure and its content so deeply integrated into her professional formation that passages surfaced automatically in relevant circumstances, the way medical protocols surfaced in clinical ones. She knew Chapter 17 specifically because Chapter 17 was the theological core of the Hospitaler's vocational framework. The long meditation on suffering, endurance, and the Emperor's purpose in permitting both, the section that novices found most difficult and veterans found most sustaining. Broven was reciting Chapter 17, not a simplified version, not the short-form passages used in public devotional settings, the full text in the correct High Gothic of the Ministorum edition, with the correct liturgical cadence that took years of practice to produce, and that she had spent 3 years of her novitiate developing, and still, on tired days, had to concentrate to maintain. He was a maintenance engineer from sublevel Quintus. He had no listed religious affiliation. She stood at the foot of his bed and listened and counted the lines. The first 42 passed with perfect diction, perfect cadence, no deviation from the approved text. She was tracking the passage so precisely that she heard the 43rd line's variation in the first syllable. A single word, appearing where the approved text had a different word, not contradicting the line's meaning, but extending it, adding a dimension to the thought that the approved text did not contain. A word that was not wrong, a word that was not in any Ministorum edition she had read, and she had read all of them. She wrote it down before she could second-guess the impulse, not in her medical chart. She pulled her personal journal from her coat pocket and wrote the word in full, with its position in the text, with the precise context of its appearance. She wrote it the way Sister Aldrich had taught her to write clinical observations. Exactly, without interpretation, because interpretation could wait, and accuracy could not be reconstructed from an imprecise memory. She stood with the journal in her hands for a moment after writing it. She looked at Cale Broven, who had finished the passage, and was sitting in the specific stillness of someone who had just put something down. He looked, she thought, with the clinical precision she was trying to maintain, like a man who had received an answer to a question he had stopped expecting anyone to address. She did not ask him where he had learned Chapter 17. She was not ready for the answer. The prayer she attempted in the afternoon was the one she always attempted when the clinical picture produced results her framework could not process. It was a short petition, 5 lines from the closing devotional of the Hospitaler's daily office, asking the Emperor for clarity of sight in assessing what was presented to her, and wisdom in distinguishing the Emperor's work from its counterfeits. She reached the 4th line. The 4th line contained the word illumination. It was followed by a relative clause, that what is false may be made plain. She had said these words, in this order, every day for 11 years. They had never previously required her to pause. She paused. The closing invocation asked the Emperor to illuminate what was false, and she was standing in a ward where 14 patients were recovering from unsurvivable injuries, at a rate her training had no category for, in a cathedral where something below the foundation was performing liturgy in sealed rooms, on a world that had been without the Astronomican's light for 40 days, and was developing, in the absence of that light, its own sources of illumination. She was afraid of what would be illuminated, not because she expected to find corruption. She knew corruption, knew its clinical signs in faith as well as in tissue, knew the specific ways that wrong belief expressed itself in the body's relationship to its own suffering. She was afraid because she did not know, with the honesty that Sister Aldrich had made non-negotiable, whether the illumination would show her something wrong or something real. And she did not know what she would do, professionally, vocationally, as a hospitaler of the Emperor's holy orders, if the illumination showed her something real and asked her what she intended to do about it. She could not finish the prayer. The words would not come, not forgotten. She could see them in the correct order, in the internal text she had maintained for 11 years. They would not come because she could not say them honestly, and she would not say them dishonestly, because dishonest prayer was not prayer. She closed her hands. She sat in the silence that the prayer had left, and tried to determine whether it was the silence of absence, or the silence of something present enough to make the prayer unnecessary. She could not determine it. She went to check on her patients. The ward was empty, not disordered, not the alarming emptiness of a space that had been vacated in distress, the scattered charts and displaced equipment that accompanied emergency movement, orderly. Beds made with the specific neatness of people who had grown up making beds correctly, and done it out of habit rather than instruction. Charts in their slots, personal items, the small accumulations of salvage and sentiment that patients gathered around themselves during extended stays, arranged on the bedside surfaces with a tidiness that none of them had shown during their admission. 14 patients, ambulatory, which she had not assessed any of them as being gone. She found them in the lower chapel. The lower chapel was 2 levels below the medici wing, accessible via the internal stairwell, a small devotional space used for private prayer and the administration of last rites to patients who could not be moved to the main nave. It had 12 pews and a single altar, and an aquila on the east wall that was not the cathedral's best work, but was old enough that its imperfections had become familiar. She had administered last rites in this chapel 4 times. She knew it at night by the light of the electric votive candles, in the specific way you knew spaces where you had sat with people while they died. They were kneeling, all 14 of them, in the pews and in the spaces between the pews where the pews had run out, facing the altar with the unified orientation of a congregation that had been given the same direction. Their voices were low and steady and completely synchronized, not the approximate synchrony of a group reciting together, but the precise unison of a single voice produced by 14 bodies. They were reciting Chapter 17. She stood in the doorway and listened and counted lines. She did not need to count far. The 43rd line came in its place, and the variation was there in 14 voices, and the word she had written in her journal was the word they said. She stood in the chapel doorway and listened to 14 people recite words they had never learned. And she thought, I should be afraid, and I am not, and I do not know which of those 2 things is the problem. Chapter 3. The Man with No Prayers to Lose. Saul had survived 11 years of imperial service without praying once, and he was beginning to understand that this had not made him safe. It had made him the only person in the building with nothing left to lose. He had been in enough sacred spaces to know that they all did the same thing to a person's sense of scale. That was the mechanism. He had worked it out on his 3rd posting in a ministorum chapel on Forge World Thalaxis, where his platoon had sheltered for 6 days during a particularly unpleasant reassignment dispute between 2 regimental commanders who had forgotten that troops in the field required resolution rather than correspondence. The chapel had been small by cathedral standards, but the principle was identical. High ceiling, vertical stone, the deliberate architectural grammar of a space that wanted you to feel the distance between yourself and whatever it had decided to put above you. It was engineering. He respected engineering. He did not feel what it was designed to make him feel, because he had identified the mechanism, and the identification had, in his experience, permanently diffused it. The Cathedral of the Undying Flame was the largest sacred space he had been inside. The mechanism was operating at full scale. He remained undiffused. He was honest enough to acknowledge this. 11 years of imperial service had produced in him a specific hard-edged relationship with honesty. The functional kind. The kind that kept you alive by refusing to let you believe comfortable things that weren't true. The cathedral was impressive. The cathedral was doing something to the quality of the air and the light and the acoustic character of the space that he did not have good secular language for, and was not going to borrow theological language to describe. He noted it and moved on, the way he noted most things that didn't fit his categories, as data, pending a better framework. He had been billeted here for 19 days. He had spoken to the cathedral staff precisely as much as the work required. The supply arrangements, the watch rotation, the twice-daily head count that he had instituted because someone had to, and he was the ranking soldier in a billet of 14 men without an officer, and the ranking soldier did the work the officer would have done, or the work didn't get done. He had attended the morning devotionals, because attendance was expected, and because he was a professional, and professionals observed local customs when the local customs were not operationally compromising. He had stood at the back. He had not participated. He did not pray. He had not prayed since he was 16 years old and had not technically prayed then either. What he had done at 16 was the specific, desperate bargaining of someone who had not yet learned what prayer cost when it was answered with silence. He had learned quickly. He had filed the experience under operational intelligence and updated his assessment of petition as a tactical resource accordingly. Unreliable, costly in expectation, not worth the debt. The question he had been carrying since he was 17 was not a prayer. It was a professional inquiry. There was a difference. He had been 17 on Taraveth Secundus. His first deployment, his first combat, the first time he had watched a man he had been ordered to follow make a decision that killed him slowly in front of people who were unable to do anything except continue following orders and keep moving. Sergeant Devan Kresh. I am 41 years old, 22 years of service. The kind of soldier who had accumulated enough competence that the accumulation itself had become a kind of doctrine, a belief that if you did everything correctly was what you got back. Kresh had done everything correctly on Taraveth Secundus. The ground had opened beneath a correctly executed advance on a correctly selected route following a correctly issued order, and the correctly following soldiers had pulled him out of the sinkhole with a spinal injury that had taken 4 days to kill him. And in those 4 days, So had been close enough to witness the specific, bewildered quality of a man watching his framework fail him in real time. The question was not why did this happen. He knew why it happened. Ground failed, bodies broke. The Imperial Guard fed its soldiers into the machinery of the Emperor's wars, and the machinery was indifferent to individual competence. He understood the mechanism. The question was whether the mechanism was the whole of it, whether there was anything underneath the mechanism that had reasons, whether the 22 years of Kresh's accumulated competence had been witnessed by anything capable of witness, or whether it had simply occurred in the dark and been extinguished in the dark, and the dark had continued. He had been carrying that question for 11 years. He had not found an answer. He had eventually stopped expecting one, which was different from no longer wanting one, but was the version he could live with. He was 19 days into a cathedral billet, and the cathedral was doing something to that question that he did not yet have a framework for. Rector Voss had found the pattern on the 42nd day, and he had been sitting with it for 2 days since, which was not how he operated, and which told him, with the administrative self-knowledge of a man who had been monitoring his own habits for 4 decades, that the pattern had produced something he was not ready to document. The documents from sublevel Tertius were not random. He had established this by cross-referencing their dates against the Ministorum liturgical calendar for the current year. The full calendar, not the simplified public version, but the complete administrative record that specified every rite, every confirmation, every devotional obligation, every census that should be performed in a functioning Ministorum district on every day of the imperial year. The sublevel Tertius documents corresponded to it exactly. Every document that had arrived corresponded to a rite that should have been performed on that date in a functioning sub-district of this cathedral's administrative zone. Not approximately, not in rough alignment with the major observances. Every minor rite, every quarterly census obligation, every seasonal devotional confirmation, performed on the correct day in the correct format. Something in sublevel Tertius was maintaining the cathedral's full liturgical practice. Not the cathedral that existed, the cathedral as it should be, in its complete form, with all its sub-districts functioning, and all its obligations met, and all its rites performed on schedule. The cathedral as procedure demanded it be, rather than as 40 days of Astronomican silence and structural collapse and dwindling supply lines had made it. He had written the conclusion in his log, and then sat with the log closed on his desk for 2 days. He had composed in those 2 days 3 separate communications, one to the upper spire, one to the Adepta Sororitas garrison, one to the Cathedral's senior staff. He had not sent any of them, because the upper spire had not responded to communication in 30 days, because the Sororitas garrison had been reduced to 11 personnel and was managing crises he had personally prioritized as more urgent than anomalous documentation, and because sending a communication to his senior staff required him to specify what action he was requesting they take, and he did not know what action was appropriate. He had decided on the 43rd morning to investigate himself. He had walked to the lower nave corridor with that intention fully formed, with the specific quality of decision that he associated with correct procedure. The clean, unambiguous sense of having identified the appropriate step and moving to take it. He had passed the door to the sublevel tertius access stairs. He had smelled the warm air. He had stood in the corridor for 1 minute and 40 seconds, which he knew because he had checked his chronometer, and then he had returned to his desk. He sat at his desk now, on the 44th day, and looked at the pattern in the documents, and looked at the outstanding matters drawer, and was, for the first time in his professional life, unable to locate the distinction between what he was doing and what he was not doing. The procedure he had built his career on required him to investigate anomalies. He had investigated anomalies for 40 years. He had never hesitated. He was afraid. He had the administrative honesty to name it finally, on the 44th day, in the privacy of his own office with the door closed. He was afraid of what the investigation would find. Not because he expected danger. He was not particularly afraid of danger, had never been a physically brave man, but had also never prioritized the question. He was afraid because the pattern in the documents pointed towards something that had no administrative category, and if he investigated and found it, his professional obligation would require him to act on it, and acting on it would require him to stop filing about it, and he did not know who he was if he stopped filing. He opened the outstanding matters drawer. He looked at it for a long time. He did not close it. He simply looked. Salt went down on the 44th day because he had been watching the cathedral staff avoid the access stairs for 3 days, with the specific awareness of a soldier who had spent 11 years cataloging the negative space of human behavior, the things people did not do, the routes they did not take, the questions they did not ask. The cathedral staff were not avoiding the access stairs, obviously. They were avoiding them the way trained professionals avoided things they had categorized as not their department, with the smooth, unnoteworthy efficiency of a detour that had become so automatic it no longer registered as a detour. He noticed. Noticing things people were not doing was, in his professional assessment, more useful than noticing things they were. The things people did were the things they were prepared to be seen doing. The things they avoided told you what they weren't prepared to look at. He had a torch and a laser gun and no theological stake in what was down there. He had the professional conviction that the only cure for information you didn't have was to go and get it. He had 11 years of carrying a question that nobody in his chain of command had been authorized to address. He unlocked the access door with the cipher from Voss's administrative roster, which he had requisitioned on day 2 of the billet under the standing military access provision, because a soldier establishing a watch rotation needed to know what he was watching, and went down. The stairs were stone, pre-heresy stone, which meant something different from the cathedral's upper construction. Older, denser, quarried from a geological period before the refinements that had made modern imperial construction more efficient and less interesting. The walls were closed. The air in the first 2 flights had the cold, settled quality of a space that had been closed long enough for the temperature to equalize with the deep stone. Then it changed. The warmth arrived gradually, the way a room's temperature arrived when you were walking toward a heat source rather than turning one on. It built with each flight of stairs, and it built in a way that was not mechanical, not the radiant warmth of a heating duct or the convective warmth of ventilation, but the warmth of presence, the specific ambient temperature of a space that had been occupied. He noted this with the clinical interest of a soldier noting relevant environmental data. He kept descending. Sublevel Tertius was not what he had expected. He had expected a condemned space to look condemned. The specific visual vocabulary of structural failure and administrative closure, the cracked walls and settled floors and water damage, and accumulated evidence of the slow entropy that empty spaces underwent when the maintenance cycle stopped. He found none of this. The stone was intact. The lumen strips, which should have been dead for 11 years, were active at a low-level output that produced not full light, but something between darkness and visibility. The quality of light in a space that was being maintained at the minimum level necessary, rather than lit for occupation. He moved through the sublevel with the systematic awareness of a man clearing a building. Arches, side chambers. The specific grid of a foundation level built to service a structure above it. Utility passages, storage alcoves, load-bearing elements, spaced with pre-heresy engineering precision that was different in character from everything built on top of it, older and denser, and somehow more certain of itself. He found the warp scar at the sublevel's center. He stopped 4 meters from it and looked at it and took the 30 seconds he always took before engaging with a new threat to fully observe, rather than immediately respond. Professional practice. 30 seconds was usually enough. It was 3 meters wide, floor to ceiling, filling the space between 2 of the pre-heresy load-bearing columns that flanked the sublevel's central axis. It had the shape of a wall, the shape of the stone wall that had presumably been there before it. But it was not stone. It was not anything he had a word for. The stone on either side of it was stone, specific, material, with texture and shadow, and the physical presence of a thing that existed in space and had boundaries. What was in the gap between the columns had the shape of all those things without having the properties. It was there the way that silence was there after sound stopped. Present, definite, occupying space, but defined by what it was not rather than what it was. The air around it was warm. The warmth had a direction. Sol had been in cold climates and warm climates, and the specific temperature management of Imperial Guard forward operating bases in 20 different environments, and he knew the difference between ambient temperature and directional warmth. This warmth was directional. It was coming from the scar, toward him, with the specific quality of something that was aware of the distance between them, and was, in its way, reducing it.
He did not step back. He was a professional. Stepping back from a threat before you had assessed it was how you ended up responding to the wrong thing.
He asked because he was a soldier, and soldiers asked for intelligence reports before they made tactical decisions. What are you? The answer did not come in a voice. He had been prepared for a voice, had half expected the theatrical machinery of a warp entity, the vox-distorted proclamation, the sensory overload that the Scholar's basic warp threat orientation module had described in terms designed to be frightening, and had succeeded in most of his cohort at being frightening. He had filed the orientation module under theoretical and waited for operational data to update it. The operational data was this. The answer came as knowledge, not received, arrived. The specific cognitive sensation of knowing something you had not known a moment before, with complete confidence in the knowledge and no memory of how you had come to hold it. The way you sometimes woke from sleep with the solution to a problem you had gone to bed carrying. The problem simply resolved in the gap between not knowing and knowing. What he knew, standing in the warmth of the warp scar in the sub-foundation of the Cathedral of the Undying Flame on the 44th day of Verath's Landing's dying, was the answer to the question he had been carrying since Taraveth Secundus. It was not a comfort. He had not wanted comfort and would not have trusted it. It was a reason structured with the complete, load-bearing architecture of something that had been built to hold weight, specific, internally consistent, accounting for everything he had witnessed in 11 years without requiring him to revise a single operational observation. Kresh's death was in it. The classified world was in it. The 22 years of accumulated competence and the 4 days of dying in the dark were all in it. And the reason did not make any of it good, did not resolve any of it into something other than what it had been, but placed it, located it in a structure large enough to contain it without the containment requiring him to pretend it was smaller than it was. He stood in the warmth and held the reason and examined it with the professional thoroughness he brought to all intelligence assessments. He could not find the flaw. He came back up at the 14th hour. He sat in the nave, in the back row where he always sat, and he looked at the aquila on the east wall and thought about the reason the way he thought about all tactical intelligence, systematically from multiple angles, testing each component against his operational experience, looking for the point where the internal logic failed or the external data contradicted. He thought for 2 hours. He found nothing that failed. He found nothing that contradicted. He was a professional. He knew that intelligence assets that were too clean were usually too clean for a reason. He knew that the most dangerous traps were the ones that contained something real, that the lie that worked was never the complete fabrication, but the truth with one thing changed. One load-bearing element substituted, something structurally identical to the genuine article that would hold your weight until it didn't. He could not find the substitution. He looked for it for 2 hours and did not find it. He went to his billet. He lay on his cot. He stared at the ceiling and thought about the answer, and about whether a true answer from a wrong source was still a true answer, and about whether it mattered where the light came from if you could see by it. He did not sleep. In the morning, he found them in the nave. 3 soldiers from the billet, Trooper Mace, Trooper Aldven, Senior Trooper Rowe, men he had served beside for 4 months and assessed with the specific, unsentimental accuracy of a ranking soldier who needed to know what his people were capable of and what they were not. Good soldiers, not exceptional. The kind of men the Imperial Guard produced in the largest quantities and deployed in the largest numbers and remembered in the smallest proportion. They were sitting in the pews, not together, distributed across 3 separate rows, each one alone, each one facing the same direction, the same posture, hands open on their knees, weight forward slightly, the specific quality of attention directed toward a fixed point. The point they were facing, all 3 of them, was not the altar. It was the door to the sublevel Tertius access stairs. They looked fine. He assessed them with the systematic thoroughness of a soldier performing a post-engagement check. Responsive, no visible injury, vital signs apparently normal from observable indicators. They looked at him when he approached with the clear, present attention of men who had not been sleeping and were not tired. They looked at him with the expression he recognized, with the slight shock of recognition from his own reflection when he had passed the nave's decorative mirror on his way to the morning watch. Peaceful, resolved, the specific quality of men who had set something down. He did not ask them what they had found down there. He sat in the pew behind Mace and looked at the door and thought about what it meant that 3 men had gone down in the night and come back and were sitting in the nave facing the door, like a compass needle facing north. He knew then that whatever was down there was not offering the same answer to everyone. It was offering the right answer, and the right answer was different for every man who asked. Chapter 4. The Archive of Wrong Things. On the morning of the 51st day, Senna Dre found a document in the restricted archive that described, in precise liturgical detail, everything that was currently happening in the cathedral, and it was dated 400 years ago. She had not been looking for it. This was the detail that stayed with her afterward, not the document itself, not its contents, not the 400-year gap between its dating and the morning she held it, but the fact that she had not been looking for it. She had been looking for something else entirely, the provenance record for a pre-heresy devotional text that had appeared in the cathedral's intake 3 weeks ago without an origin stamp, which was the kind of minor archival irregularity that accumulated into larger problems if you did not address it promptly, and which she had been intending to address for 2 weeks and had not addressed because larger irregularities had been demanding her attention. The provenance search had taken her into the restricted archive's 7th level, which she visited rarely because the 7th level contained the cathedral's oldest documents, and the oldest documents were the most fragile, and the most fragile documents were the ones that suffered most from being handled, and she handled them only when the handling was necessary. She had the provenance file she needed in her hands and was returning it to its case when the adjacent file caught the edge of her sleeve and slid forward on its shelf, and she caught it before it fell, and she looked at what she was holding. The case was standard Ministorum restricted archive housing, the green lacquered plastic that the central administration had been using for classified documentation since the 38th millennium, identifiable at a glance by its color and by the lock mechanism that required both a cipher and a physical key, both of which Senna held by virtue of her position. The case's label read, Voss, C. Rector's Crisis Report, M4 1.089, suppressed, Level 4. The label was old enough that the ink had faded to a brown that was almost the color of the case itself, which was why she had never noticed it in 20 years of working in this archive. She looked at the label for a moment. She looked at the date. M4 1.089, 4 centuries ago, in this calendar, in this cathedral, under a rector whose name matched no one in her current personnel records, and who had therefore been dead for a very long time. Crisis report. She unlocked the case. She sat down at the reading table she had carried up to the 7th level for exactly the kind of extended session she had not planned to have today, and she opened the document, and she began to read. Rector Cassius Vane had been, from the evidence of his writing, a man of similar temperament to Voss, precise, institutional, with the specific quality of attention that long administrative service produced in people who had chosen the work rather than been assigned to it. His sentences were formal and correctly structured, and occasionally in the margins, annotated in a smaller, less formal hand, that she read as his private thinking bleeding into his official record. The places where the document's requirements had not been quite sufficient to contain what he was observing. She read the first 3 pages with the clinical detachment of a trained archivist processing an unfamiliar document, categorizing, noting, building the contextual framework before engaging with specific content. The detachment did not survive the 4th page. Day 38 of the present crisis, Vane had written, in the formal hand, I record the following for the benefit of my successors in this office, with the specific hope that this record will be found before the necessity of its contents repeats itself, rather than after. The documents appeared from sealed areas. Vane described them in 3 pages of meticulous detail. The cipher seals of dead administrators, the correct formatting, the accuracy of the census figures, the way the documents corresponded to the liturgical calendar, performing on paper the rites that the cathedral's damaged districts could no longer perform in practice. The healings in the Medicare ward. Vane's description ran to 2 pages. the impossible recovery rates. The patients were sleeping with the expression of people who had put something down. The ward becomes, in chirurgeon's words, the most restful space in the cathedral, which should be a comfort, and is not. The liturgical responses from the condemned sublevel, Vane had heard them himself. He described the antiphonal, the specific antiphonal, the antiphonal of the Undying Watch, named correctly, described with the precision of a man who knew his liturgy, coming through the foundation stone with the clarity of a sound that had not been diminished by the distance it had traveled. The census report in his own handwriting, from an office he had not left, covering changes he had not made, accurate to every figure. A soldier billeted in the cathedral, Vane wrote, in the formal hand, and then, in the marginal annotation, in the smaller script, Guardsman Teve Marin, 3rd Verath Auxiliaries, 1st Transit Posting, no religious affiliation on record. He went down on the 44th day. He came back. He does not appear to have been harmed. He sits in the nave and faces the door. He has not spoken about what he found. I have not asked him. I am recording this because the pattern requires that I record everything, and because I suspect that what happened to Guardsman Marin is relevant to what will happen next, and because I do not yet know what will happen next. Senna sat with the document in her hands and looked at the window above the reading table, which showed the ash-filtered light of Verath's Landing's 51st day, and thought about Trooper Saul sitting in the nave facing the door to the sub-level Tertius access stairs with the expression she had noted in passing 3 days ago and had not yet found the category for. She turned to the report's final pages. Rector Vane's conclusion and recommendation occupied a single page. The conclusion was 3 paragraphs of careful institutional analysis that she read in full and found, to her considerable discomfort, entirely consistent with her own parallel archives findings. The recommendation was a single paragraph. The paragraph had been redacted, professionally, completely, with the black lacquer overprint that the Ministorum used for Level 4 suppression orders, the grade reserved for information whose circulation was assessed as actively dangerous, not redacted clumsily, not with the ink-over-ink desperation of someone destroying a document in a hurry, carefully, by someone who had decided with administrative deliberation that the recommendation should not be readable by whoever found this document. She looked at the suppression cipher in the document's margin. She did not recognize it. It was not a cathedral cipher, not Vane's, not any of his listed staff, not any of the administrative hierarchies she had records for. It was an external cipher, something from outside the cathedral's administrative chain. She wrote in her personal log, "Someone outside this cathedral's administration read Rector Vane's report 400 years ago and suppressed his recommendation. The suppression was deliberate, and the cipher is external. This means the recommendation was known outside this building. This means someone outside this building decided it should not be followed, or should not be known, or both. I need to know who, I need to know why, and I need the unredacted version, which exists somewhere in this archive, because Level 4 suppression orders require the original to be retained in restricted storage, even when all circulating copies are suppressed." She looked at the time. She looked at the 7 levels of the restricted archive surrounding her. She went to work. The history took her 3 hours to assemble, because the history had been distributed, not deliberately scattered, she thought, but organically separated, the way related documents separated over centuries when the people filing them did not know they were related and filed them by date and type rather than by subject. The second occurrence, M40.774, 300 years before Vane, 315 years before the current crisis. A chirurgeon's report rather than a rector's, which meant it had come from a different institutional perspective. the medical rather than the administrative, and had survived in the archive's medici records section rather than the restricted administrative files. The chirurgeon's name was listed as Hospitaler Dara Ven. Senna noted the rank and felt the specific cold precision of a pattern completing itself. The impossible recoveries, the ward's quality of peace. 14 patients, 14 the same number, sitting in the lower chapel reciting a litany they had not been taught. The third occurrence, M40.312. Earlier still, a partial record this time, water damage to the first third, the opening context lost, only the latter portion surviving. Enough to see the shape. Enough to see that this one had ended differently from the others, or had appeared to. A gap in the records of only 3 months, shorter than the others, and a population count that showed a smaller increase than the 2 later events. Something had been done. The record did not specify what. The fourth occurrence, M39. The year was damaged, the final 2 digits illegible, which placed it somewhere in a century-long window in the 39th millennium. The oldest surviving account, a single page, badly deteriorated, the handwriting archaic enough to require her full paleographic attention. She read it slowly, reconstructing damaged sections from context, and found the same pattern in language 4 centuries older than Vane's. The same sealed spaces producing documents, the same healings, the same voices in the foundation, and at the bottom of the page, in the archaic script of a writer who had run out of official language and reached for something more direct. The building remembers everything that has been prayed in it, and the thing below remembers with it, and I do not know how to tell these apart. She sat with this for a long time. 4 occurrences, 4 centuries of this cathedral's history, at irregular intervals that corresponded. When she checked them against the regional warp instability records she found in the archive's navigation section, to periods of elevated disturbance along the warp route that ran past Verath's landing. Each occurrence following the same pattern, each one ending with a gap in the records, each gap followed by a population count that was higher than before the gap. She did the arithmetic. She had done it before, on the day she had first begun to suspect the pattern. She did it again now with the full data set. The cathedral's baseline population at each post-gap resumption was higher than its pre-gap count by margins that varied between 4% and 11%. The variations were consistent with a specific mechanism. Not all of the population increase was from new arrivals. Some of it was from people who had been in the cathedral during the gap and whose census records, afterward, showed no anomalies. People who were, by every administrative measure, the same people they had been before, whose records showed continuous residence, whose documentation was authentic. She sat with the arithmetic for the time it took her to be certain she was reading it correctly. Then she sat with it for the time it took her to be certain she was not wrong. She was not wrong. Neve came to her at the 2nd hour of the afternoon, with the specific quality of movement that Senna had come to recognize in people who had been carrying something for longer than was comfortable and had finally identified a place to set it down. She sat across from Senna at the 3rd level reading table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at Senna with the expression of someone requesting information rather than comfort. Senna told her about the ward first, because she wanted to understand the current state before presenting the history. Neve told her. The 14 patients were back in the medical wing, sleeping normally, showing no clinical indicators of distress. They had returned from the lower chapel in the early morning hours with the same orderly, unhurried quality that characterized everything they did now, and had returned to their beds and had slept. The influence had spread, not through contact, through proximity, through the specific ambient quality that the recovered patients produced in the spaces they occupied. Patients near them healed faster. Not dramatically faster, measurably faster, the kind of acceleration that showed up in clinical charts rather than in visible transformation. Staff near them reported a quality of calm that several had described, in Neve's informal inquiries, as the best they had felt since the Astronomican went dark. The Medici wing was, by every metric Neve possessed, functioning better than it ever had. Neve said this last in the flat tone of someone reporting a finding that was not behaving like a finding should. Senna recognized the tone. It was the tone she herself used when presenting evidence that the categories were not handling correctly. She showed Neve the documents. All of them: Vane's report, the chirurgeon's account, the partial record, the single deteriorated page from the 39th millennium. She arranged them in chronological order and walked Neve through them the way she walked everyone through archival evidence, in sequence, without commentary, allowing the pattern to emerge from the material rather than from her interpretation of it. Never read in silence. She read carefully, with the quality of attention Senna had come to respect. The attention of someone who was reading for precision rather than for confirmation. When she reached population arithmetic, she went still in the specific way that people went still when the mathematics produced a result they had been avoiding. The population count rises, Neve said. She was not asking. She was thinking out loud in the way that the well-trained thought, by externalizing the process, using speech as a check against internal assumption. Not because people arrive from outside, because... She stopped. She looked at the numbers again. Because the thing in the sublevel is not taking people. It is adding them. Senna waited. An archivist presented documents. She did not interpret them for the reader. The prayers, Neve said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone following an argument to its conclusion against their preference. It answers prayers. That is what it does. That is the mechanism. The healings, the documents, the voices in the foundation. It is answering. And if you answer a prayer completely enough, if you give a prayer everything it was reaching for... She stopped again. I looked at her hands. Look at the population figures. A prayer that is answered completely enough becomes something, has weight, has presence. The people who prayed are still themselves, but something of what they prayed for has been given independent existence, and that existence is in the cathedral, and the census counts it, because the census counts everything that is present, and what the warp scar creates is, in some sense, present. Senna said, the records are authentic because what produces them is real. Yes. Never looked at the redacted recommendation. Burn it, she said. That is what Vane recommended. Burn the sub-foundation, collapse the access, destroy the scar before it produces enough answered prayers to fill the cathedral with things that are present but not people. Senna said, the suppression cipher is external. Someone outside this cathedral's administration read Vane's recommendation and suppressed it. Neve looked at her. Why would someone suppress that? Because, Senna said carefully, the alternative recommendation, the one that was not suppressed, the one that someone wanted to remain readable, is elsewhere in this archive, and I am going to find it. It took her 4 hours. 4 hours of systematic search through the restricted archive's deepest holdings, following the suppression cipher's trail through the Ministerum's administrative hierarchy until she found the source. An external ecclesiastical oversight body that had reviewed Vane's report in M41.091 2 years after the crisis and had issued a counter-recommendation in place of the suppressed one. The counter-recommendation had been filed in the archive under a classification cipher she had not previously encountered and would not have recognized without the 4 hours of trail following that had led her to it. The document was a single page. The handwriting was formal, institutional, the handwriting of a body rather than an individual. the specific impersonality of a committee's recorded conclusion. It read, "Consecrate the sub-foundation. Do not investigate. Do not seal. Consecrate. The accumulated faith of this place is the only thing it cannot answer. Feed the walls, not the wound." And beneath it, in a smaller hand that broke the document's institutional impersonality with the force of something personal. "I do not know if this ends it. I know that it is the only thing I have seen slow it. The cathedral itself is the weapon. Use it." The smaller hand was Vane's. He had found a way to preserve his recommendation after all. She held the document in the low lumen light of the archive's deepest level and read it twice. She memorized it with the specific, deliberate memory of a professional who did not trust important information to exist only in a single location. Then she climbed back up through the archive's 7 levels, through the accumulated 4 centuries of this cathedral's documented existence, past the filing of Hospitaller Ven's impossible recoveries and the partial record of the 3rd occurrence and the single deteriorated page from the 39th millennium, and she emerged into the nave. The nave was fuller than it had been that morning. She knew this with the certainty of someone whose professional reflex was to count things. She had counted the nave's population at the morning devotional, as she counted it every morning. The way some people check the weather and some people check the news. The count this morning had been 3,214. She had noted it in her log. She counted now. She counted twice, because the first number was wrong. She moved through the nave's sections systematically, the way she moved through the archive's levels, by quadrant, with a running total, checking each section against the previous count before moving to the next. She finished at the nave's back wall. She looked at her total. 3,461, 247 more than this morning. Not new arrivals from the road. She would have been notified. The watch rotation logged it. The food distribution adjusted for it. Not a counting error. She had counted twice, and the count matched. 247 people who were present in the cathedral's nave on the 51st evening, who had not been present in the cathedral's nave on the 51st morning. She looked at their faces. She looked for the tells, the specific microscopic inconsistencies that forgeries showed to a trained eye, the ways that things which were not quite authentic betrayed themselves under sufficient scrutiny. She had spent 20 years developing the ability to find those tells. She found nothing. Every face she examined was present, specific, occupied by whatever had always occupied it. Every person she looked at looked back with the clear, unremarkable quality of someone who existed and had always existed, and had no reason to consider the matter further. She stood in the nave with Rector Vane's 400-year recommendation in her hands, and looked at the faces of people she did not know and could not remember arriving. And she understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has spent 20 years learning to read documents, that the archive was not just recording what was happening. It had started to include her. Chapter 5. The Weapon in the Walls. So had been given an answer he could not unfind, a weapon he did not know how to use, and approximately 4 hours before the cathedral stopped being a building and became something else entirely, and the only person left who understood any of this was a woman he had never spoken to, holding a 400-year-old document in a nave full of people who should not exist. He found her because she was counting. He recognized the behavior immediately, the systematic movement through a space, the eyes tracking in the specific pattern of someone building a running total rather than simply observing, the slight pause at each section boundary, while the sub-count was committed to memory before moving to the next. He had done it himself, every morning of the billet, because a ranking soldier without an officer kept count of his people the way an archivist kept count of her documents. Because the count was the baseline against which everything else was measured, and without the baseline you could not identify a deviation, and an unidentified deviation was how people died.
He watched her finish the count. He watched her face when she arrived at the total.
He had seen that expression before. Not on her. He had not spoken to the Rector archivist in 19 days of shared building, had noted her existence the way he noted the existence of all non-operational personnel, and had not found cause to do more than that. He had seen it on soldiers who had just finished counting their unit after an engagement, and arrived at a number that did not match the number they had started with, and not in the direction that meant reinforcements had arrived. He crossed the nave to her. "How many over?" he said. Not a question. A request for a specific figure, in the tone he used when he needed data rather than assessment. She looked at him with the evaluative attention of someone determining whether a new variable was relevant or intrusive. She apparently determined it was relevant. 247, she said. Since this morning, no external arrivals logged. He looked at the nave. He looked at the faces he didn't know, not clustered, not conspicuous, distributed through the congregation, with the specific evenness of something that had been placed rather than something that had wandered in. "How long do we have?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "But I know what happens if we don't act, and I know what the only thing that has ever slowed it is, and I know that neither of those pieces of information is useful without the other people in this building who have the remaining pieces." She looked at him with the directness of someone who had spent 4 hours in a deep archive and emerged with more urgency than she had descended with. "I'm Senadre. I keep the records here." "So," he said, "I keep the perimeter." He looked at the door to the sublevel tertius access stairs. "We need Voss and the Hospitaller." "Yes," she said. She was already moving. They found Voss at his desk, which was where So had assessed he would be, because in 19 days of observation, he had not once seen the Rector somewhere unexpected. He was sitting with the outstanding matters drawer open in front of him, which So had not seen before, and which he filed as significant without yet knowing why. Neve came from the Medici wing when Senna sent the order for her. She arrived still carrying her clinical chart, which she set on Voss's desk with the efficiency of someone who had decided that the information on it was now more relevant to a different conversation than the one it had been prepared for. The four of them occupied the office with the specific quality of people who had been in the same building for weeks and were meeting properly for the first time, which was a quality Saul recognized from his military experience as the quality that preceded either very effective action or very costly miscommunication, depending on whether the people involved were honest with each other in the first 7 minutes. He was honest in the first sentence. "I went down to sublevel Tertius 6 days ago," he said. "I found the warp scar. I asked it a question and it answered me. I have been sitting with the answer for 6 days, and I cannot find the flaw in it, and I need you to know that before we go further, because a man with an answer already in him is a different kind of variable than a man without one, and you should have accurate intelligence about your variables." The three of them looked at him. Voss with the careful neutrality of an administrator processing an unexpected filing. Neve with the clinical attention she gave everything that was potentially relevant to a diagnosis. Senna with the evaluative precision of someone determining whether a document was authentic. Then Voss said, "I have not investigated." He said it in the same flat register So had used, the register of someone providing accurate intelligence about themselves rather than a favorable account. "I identified the pattern 7 days ago. I have known what I should do for 7 days. I have been in this office." He looked at the open drawer. "I am going to close this drawer now and not open it again." He closed it. "Tell me what you found." They told each other. Saul went first. The descent. The warp scar, the answer, the 3 soldiers in the nave the following morning, with their resolved expressions and their fixed orientation. Neve went second. The recoveries, the antiphonal, Broven reciting Chapter 17. The 14 patients in the lower chapel, the spreading calm. Voss went third. The documents, the liturgical calendar correspondence, the census report in his own handwriting, the cipher seal's perfect-imperfect lower loop. Sene went last. The 4 occurrences, the population arithmetic, Vane's recommendation, the 4 words in smaller script at the document's foot. The cathedral itself is the weapon. The silence after she finished had the quality of a silence in which a shape had just become visible. The specific cognitive moment when the pattern resolved from noise into signal and the resolution was permanent. The way you could not unsee a face in a picture once you had seen it. It cannot answer the Emperor, Neve said. She said it the way she said clinical findings, not as a belief, not as an expression of faith, but as a mechanism, a property of the thing they were dealing with, the way certain compounds could not dissolve in certain solutions, regardless of what you wanted them to do. It can produce answers, it can produce healing, documents, voices, reasons, warmth, the feeling of being known. It cannot produce the Emperor. The genuine article is the one thing the warp scar has no mechanism for. And the cathedral? She looked at the walls of Voss's office, the 4-century-old stone of them, the specific density of a structure that had been prayed in without cessation for 417 years. The cathedral is saturated with faith directed at something the warp scar cannot replicate. That faith is in the stone. It has been accumulating for 4 centuries. It is the one thing in this building the scar cannot answer. Rector Vane consecrated the sub-foundation, Sena said. He began in the nave and moved downward. Every level, every corridor, every sealed space. The consecration rite applied to the building itself, not to the people in it, not to the wound in the sublevel, but to the walls. Feeding the walls, he called it. The accumulated faith of a correct consecration added to what was already there. It didn't end, So said. He was not being negative. He was being accurate, which was a different thing. No, Sena said, but it slowed it. The gap after Vane's crisis was 2 years. The gap after the 3rd occurrence, which based on the partial record appears to have included a consecration, was 3 months. The thing retreats when the walls are strong enough. It does not go. It waits. She looked at him steadily. Given the current rate of population increase, I estimate we have between 3 and 5 hours before the cathedral's count becomes unmanageable. A consecration begun now, conducted correctly, gives us the best available probability of a 3-month problem rather than a permanent one. Saul processed this. 3 months was not a solution. 3 months was time. Time for the upper spire to respond. Time for a proper ecclesiarchal response to be organized. Time for the Adepta Sororitas garrison to be reinforced. 3 months was the difference between a contained crisis and an uncontained one. 3 months was operationally significant. The consecration requires real faith, Neve said. She looked at Saul with the directness she gave difficult clinical information, not answered faithfully, not the faith of people who have received something from the sublevel and are consequently inclined toward belief. The faith of people who believe without having been given anything for it, unrewarded, unreinforced. She paused. The faith of people who have been on a world without the Astronomican for 51 days and believe anyway. The 3 of them looked at Saul. He understood what the look meant before anyone said it. That leaves me out, he said. He said it with the flatness of a man presenting a logistical constraint, not self-pity, not bitterness, simply the accurate identification of a variable that affected the plan. I have the answer in me. Whatever I had before I went down there, it's been replaced. I can't give you unreinforced faith. I've been reinforced." No one contradicted him. He thought for a moment. Then, "Someone needs to stay in the nave. Someone needs to maintain the count, watch the exits, make sure the people who shouldn't be there don't go somewhere they shouldn't be." He looked at the door. "A defensive position. I understand its purpose." Voss said, "Then we go down." Sol watched them descend. He watched until the door to the access stairs closed behind Senna. She went last, with the document in her coat and the specific quality of someone who had been heading towards something for 4 hours and had now arrived at the heading's destination. And then he turned back to the nave and did the work he had been assigned. He counted. He moved through the nave's sections with the systematic thoroughness that 19 days of maintaining a watch rotation had built into his body, building the running total, checking each section against the previous, arriving at the back wall with a number that was larger than the number Senna had given him 40 minutes ago. He noted it. He did not record it anywhere. He was a soldier without a log, and the recording would have to wait. He watched the ones he didn't recognize. They were not doing anything alarming. They were present in the nave with the same even, unhurried quality he had observed in Maze and Aldven and Rowe for 6 days. The quality of people who had received something and were waiting, with patience that had no visible bottom, for the next thing. They moved slowly. They spoke rarely. When they looked at him, they looked with the warmth that he had been looking at for 6 days and had not yet found the flaw in. Some of them, as the hour progressed, began to leave. Not quickly, not all at once. Adrift. 2 here, 3 there, moving toward the nave's side exits and the internal corridors and the stairwells that led to the cathedral's lower levels, with the unhurried directedness of people following a pull too gentle to resist and too constant to ignore. He tracked the movement. He did not follow. He was on the defensive position, and the defensive position was the nave. He sat in the back row where he always sat, and he held his laser gun across his knees, and he waited. The warmth arrived from below at the 2nd hour. Not an increase, a change in quality. The resident warmth of the nave, which had been building for weeks, shifted register the way a sound shifted when its source began to move, acquiring a new character without losing its original one. Underneath the familiar warmth, something that was not warmth exactly, but that occupied the same category. A pressure, very gentle, the way the building itself was exhaling something it had been holding. He sat with it. He breathed it in and breathed it out, and held the laser gun and counted the faces. At the 3rd hour, more of the unrecognized ones left. The rate increased, not rushing, not fleeing, but a steady outward movement, the way a tide receded. He watched them go. He did not know where they were going. He suspected they were going somewhere they had been called from, or somewhere the warmth was directing them, or somewhere that the 4 people currently in the sub-foundation were making it necessary for them to go. He did not have the framework to be certain. He held the count. He watched the exits. Neve came up first. She emerged from the access door at the 3rd hour and 40 minutes, in the specific condition of someone who had been doing difficult work in a difficult environment for a sustained period, not physically injured, but carrying the quality of someone whose professional resources had been drawn on heavily and had held. She sat in the nearest pew. She looked at her hands. She looked at Sol. "The rite is proceeding," she said. "Voss is leading it. He is..." She paused, selecting the word with the precision she brought to clinical observations. "He is exactly what the rite requires. He performs it the way he files his reports, because it is the correct procedure, and because procedure is what he is, And because the fact that he is afraid of what is in that room does not alter the procedural requirement 1 degree. She looked at him. I have never seen faith expressed that way before. It is the most useful thing I have witnessed in this building. Sol said, the ward will need restaffing. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. Yes, she said. It will. Voss came up at the 4th hour. He came up the way he did everything, with the measured step of a man moving between tasks, at the pace his work required. His face had the specific quality Sol associated with people who had been somewhere that had asked more of them than they had been prepared to give, and had given it anyway, and were now taking stock of what remained. He sat at the pew's end. He folded his hands on his knees. He looked at the nave, at the population, which was measurably smaller than it had been an hour ago. The unrecognized faces thinned by the steady outward drift to a number Sol could manage with his current count. He looked at it with the expression of a man checking a figure against an expectation. The rite is complete, he said. Sol looked at the access door. He counted to 60. He counted to 120. He watched the door. He calculated with the professional thoroughness he brought to all tactical assessments what the probability distribution of outcomes looked like, and what the response to each outcome would be, and which of the available responses required Senadre to emerge from that door under her own direction, and which required him to go back down. At 180 seconds, the door opened. Senna came up slowly, with the particular quality of movement of someone who had been still for a long time and was reacquainting their body with the requirement to move. She crossed the nave to where he and Neve and Voss were sitting. She sat down. She looked at her hands with the expression of someone examining a document for tells. The professional scrutiny of 20 years of archival authentication applied to her own skin, looking for the microscopic inconsistencies that forgeries showed to a trained eye. The silence held for the length of time it held. Sol said, "Is it finished?" Voss said, "The rite is complete." Neve said, "The ward will need restaffing." Senna said nothing. She was still looking at her hands with the expression of someone checking for tells she could not find. Sol decided that was enough of an answer. He picked up his laser gun. He stood. He looked at the nave, the real population of it, the people he recognized, the count he could verify against his baseline. And he made the professional assessment that the perimeter required checking and went to check it. He still had the answer in him. He suspected he always would. It sat in the same place where the question had sat for 11 years. The specific interior location where Taraveth Secundus lived, where Kresh's 4 days lived, where the classified world and its classified darkness lived. And it fit there with the precise fit of a thing that had been made for the space it occupied. He found he didn't mind as much as he thought he should. He did not examine that finding closely, because he was a professional, and professionals did not pull at threads they were not prepared to follow all the way down. He walked the perimeter. The cathedral was quieter than it had been in 51 days. The stone was the same stone it had always been, dense, pre-heresy, saturated with 4 centuries of accumulated devotion directed at something the sub-basement could never produce. Outside, through the narrow slits of the cathedral's high windows, the ash-filtered light of Verath's landing was doing something it had not done in 51 days. It was, perhaps, very slightly less grey than it had been. He noted it. He filed it. He moved on. Epilogue: The Devotional of Verath's Landing. The following text is reproduced from the Ministorum Commemorative Liturgical Register, Segmentum Obscurus Diocese, date of composition unknown. It is currently in active use across the Cathedral district of Verath's Landing as the standard closing devotional for the annual feast of the Undying Flame. The text has been approved for diocesan use by the relevant ecclesiastical authority. No irregularities have been noted in the approval documentation. It is presented here in full for the use of the faithful. The devotional of the Undying Flame, for use at the feast of the Cathedral's continuance to be spoken by the officiant, with congregational responses as marked. We give thanks for the Cathedral of the Undying Flame, which has stood for 4 centuries and more against the darkness that presses at all walls. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for the faithful who sheltered within it in the time of the great rift's opening, when the Astronomican's light was taken from this world and the stars became unreadable, and the darkness below the foundation grew warm with the patience of something that had been waiting. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for those who kept the records in that time, who maintained the count when the count became difficult, who preserved what was authentic when authenticity became a question without an easy answer. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for those who tended the bodies of the faithful, who documented what the body confirmed even when the confirmation was frightening, who could not finish a prayer they could not say honestly, and said it anyway when the time required it. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for those who went down into the place of warmth and came back carrying something they had not carried before, and who stood at the defensive position regardless, and who did not pull at threads they were not prepared to follow all the way down. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for those who found the document that had waited 4 centuries to be found, and who read it, and who acted on it before the count became unmanageable, and whose hands showed no tells when they were examined afterward. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for the warmth that answered every prayer except one. We give thanks. The walls hold. We give thanks for the one prayer it could not answer, which is the prayer we speak now, in this place, in the correct form, with the correct words, directed at the only thing in the universe that the warmth below the foundation could not produce and cannot produce, and will never be able to produce, however long it waits and however warm it becomes. We give thanks. The walls hold. Speak now the closing invocation. Speak it completely. Speak it in the knowledge that it is the one thing this building requires of you, that nothing else in this building can give. Speak the 43rd line. The approved text of the 43rd line is on record with the Ministorum Diocesan Office. The version currently spoken by the congregation of the Cathedral of the Undying Flame contains one additional word. The Diocesan Office has not yet been notified of the variation. The walls hold. For the Emperor, for Verath's Landing, for the Undying Flame, Voidborne terrors, thank you for descending with us. We will see you in the dark.